Welcome to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DVS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist, welcoming you to our 111th episode. These days, there is such an overload of near-term developments that we often lack the bandwidth to absorb and appreciate our medium-term challenges and imperatives. Calamitous wars and spiking interest rates and great power rivalry, these things have not obviated the challenges and need to think about climate change and sustainability. And yet, our attention these days is largely focused on the former and not sufficient, in my view, on the latter. So let's take a step back today and look at our challenges around sustainable food and all sorts of issues and offshoots. Mind that, we'll talk about why we offshoot later around it. We have two entrepreneurs with us, Dirk and Lelya Eichelberger. Dirk is the CEO of Singapore Aquaculture Technologies. In other words, he runs a fish farm right here in Singapore. And more on that, including the tech that goes around it later. Lelya is one of the forces behind Straits Market and Alghemy in Singapore. Straits Market is an e-commerce platform for home delivery of organic produce. She is now spending a lot of time to launch Alghemy, a skincare product range that offers a proprietary ingredient while emphasizing clean, green, and blue beauty. Dirk and Lelya, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you.
Pleasure being here.
Great to have you. We've had very casual conversations about what you guys do, and I think it'll be just fantastic for our listeners to talk about your journey and the challenges that you face in your journey. So let's start with Dirk. Dirk, let's go back. We'll refer to your company as SAT, Singapore Aquatic Technology, SAT. So you and Michael Voigtman started this way back in 2012, but not initially to do fish farming. Am I correct?
That's right. We had a kind of a sabbatical, a break in our careers, and we were looking what's the next big thing to do. And food and energy were big topics. So food as in protein and energy as in oil. And with microalgae, we found a renewable source for both. So we started to grow microalgae, and we did that on a traditional kelong or a fish farm in Singapore.
Tell me a little bit about your background how come you're an expert on microalgae or anything around that?
Well, actually, I'm not. I'm an economist by training. But Michael is a chemist, and he knows a bit more about that. He also is good in biology. But we were intrigued by the potential that was around microalgae. We also had an additional founder of that concept at the time, who was very scientifically properly educated in the potential of microalgae. So we jumped on it and gave it a try.
So jumping is the right word. I mean, this is a decade ago, sustainability and environmental issues were there, but not as fashionable as it is today. So you took the jump. Tell me about those early days. What kind of challenges did you face? What kind of learning curve did you have?
Well, we started with a very simple setup. We were a very small team on that kelong. We had simple tools. The biggest challenge initially for any microalgae culture is to keep the culture alive. Those cultures tend to crash. There are lots of contaminants in the air. And in particular, if you want to work with an open concept, with an open process and not a closed one, which is much more expensive, then that's the major challenge, keep the algae alive. And the other challenge was the environment at the time. You remember fracking became very strong in the US, oil prices went down. So the idea to have biofuels from microalgae was commercially not really viable. And I must admit, we also missed the connection to the big players in the industry. So concurrently with that challenge, SFA, the Singapore Food Agency, came to us and said, look, guys, it's great what you're doing here with your microalgae on a fish farm. But in order to keep the fish farm license alive, you have to produce fish. And that was the start and the next endeavor that, again, we jumped in. And we were kind of in the same spot, a source for protein, not energy, but at least a source for protein. And we were keen to do it, but from the beginning, we knew we wanted to do it differently. At least differently how it's been done in Singapore, the traditional farming. We knew that that was probably not the way to be successful in the long run.
So tell me about those learnings around sort of the pivot toward fish farming. Okay, you get a nudge from the public sector. and it's sort of necessary that you have to do it to maintain the license. But still, I mean, what did you guys know about fish farming at that time?
Well, we didn't know much, but we had gensets on that kelong. We had pumps, we had filters, we had also floating containers for those algae. And we thought initially it cannot be that difficult now to put also fish in addition in there. And very early, actually in 2013, we developed that concept, or we didn't develop it, but we propagated it in Singapore, that concept of closed containment systems, meaning you have a tank or any vessel, so to speak, for the fish, where you define the conditions of the water and you don't rely on the outside water. And that was something that our algae and our fish processes had in common. So basically, we tried to keep algae on the back burner, but continue with fish. And then, of course, fish became something you could immediately sell, and you had income. So we continued doing both, but I guess the fish part was more promising.
Okay, lots to talk about on the fish side, but I just want to ask Lelya, even before we talk about your brand, so you were watching this thing happen and all this discussion on microalgae and so on. What was your take? I mean, did you think that this had promises just in the context of fish, or there were other potential?
Well, we started with just algae. So the pivoting to fish was something new for me, and we had no background in fish whatsoever. But I felt that the Michael Voigtman and Dirk could handle the situation, because how hard is it to rear some fish? This is what we thought.
Right.
Can it be that difficult? So I thought, I was gung-ho about it. And also at this point in time, the reason also for the pivot is there was an algae bloom in those years, and we were the only one left with fish alive. Many of the farmers in the surrounding area had lost their stock.
I see.
So the government was then knocking on our door and saying, well, how could it be that you guys still have live fish given the circumstances? So I was so when it comes to the fish, I had no qualms that they would be able to create something in that environment, in that space.
And during this period, you were busy with Straits Market.
Exactly. Well, it was slightly later. Straits Market happened because of the fish, because I was sick and tired of having everybody come over for coffee to pick up the fish. Because I became the fish farmer's wife. So they would come over to the house. Either I had to offer wine or coffee. And I said, you know what? I can't do this every day. So I set up an e-commerce site. I was used to selling anyway. I said, this is a new venue. And at that time in 2015, there weren't that many in that space as well. So I said, I'll try, I'll take a dab at e-commerce. And I started the e-commerce site, and then it just grew from there, because others didn't just want to buy fish. They also wanted in one basket have some vegetables included, some meats included, some chicken, and everything had to be in the same ethos and mission as our fish, which was no hormones, no growth hormones, no antibiotics, and we thought we would try to be as organic as possible. So it should reflect the same ethos that we were working on with our fish farm.
Okay, Lelya. So these guys are running a fish farm. You're running your e-commerce platform, and now seems like a few years later you make this pivot, and now you're working on this new concept called Alghemy. Right. So let's talk about that journey.
Okay. So it started with a friend of mine, a dear friend, and also a serial entrepreneur. Her name is Kayori. And she and I were looking at this algae at first and thinking it would be great to make a bath out of the algae. But of course, you can't just slather algae on you. You have to extract the algae, get the richness of the omegas that are in the algae, and then be able to use it. So she comes from the point that she always wanted effective, clean beauty creams. And that's why she was interested in the algae. I come from the point, from the angle where I wanted to find a use for our algae, since it's going into, they're pivoting into fish farming. It's a shame to have a gone so far with the algae and not do anything with it, especially if there's so much interest. In my girlfriend, who already expressed interest, and then also we had a third angle coming in, which was the scientist, Dr. Sergey. And he, through SAT, who was working with SAT, he had an encapsulating technology, which was innovative. And I would say it's the only one in that sense of what he had achieved. And so we thought, my girlfriend and I, would this be a great opportunity, fortuitous opportunity for all three of us to come together and do something with the algae that can be encapsulated into a stable form to later be put into a cream that we can use. And so that's how the three of us came together to create this Alghemy.
Okay. But this is a work in progress. When I go to your website, some products are available, some are in the pipeline.
Exactly. I'll be straightforward with you. This is a completely new ingredient. There is nothing on this planet like it. We are the first to have been able to encapsulate the omega-3 and make it into an ingredient. And now we've been struggling for the last 4 years, even through COVID, to make sure that it's a stable product. And we've been tweaking. And therefore, we have the products coming on board, but we're also doing trials and making sure that it stays stable and that it can be rolled out to the bigger consumer base.
I remember talking to you about this the first time, and you said that, people take omega-3 as a fish protein or a fish byproduct.
That's right.
But the fish eat the algae to create the protein, so why don't we just go to the source?
That's right.
I like your characterization very much. I think our listeners have picked up the fact that when I was talking about this with Dirk, we were using the word algae, and when we talked to Lelya, we were saying algae. I think it's interchangeable. We can use both. So don't change, Dirk. Stay with algae.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about the point that I sort of picked up on Lelya, but I would like a little more elaboration, which is looking at microalgae or creating a fish farm or even the cosmetics part. You are all coming from this angle of the E part of the ESG, that you want things that are more sustainable or organic or better for us. So let's talk a little bit about the fish farming aspect on the ESG side.
Well, ESG, of course, is everywhere now. And if you look at environment in fish farming, you think of pollution, you think of discharge, you think of carbon footprint, but you also think of freshwater use and land use. So from the beginning, we wanted to do something without fresh water. We wanted to use seawater. It's infinitely available on this planet. And we also wanted to avoid land use because in particular in Singapore, it's pretty expensive. So that was not an option. So these issues are everywhere, and if you want to be successful, you have to master them. And the most important aspect for us right now is zero waste farming. We have to avoid discharge into the surrounding water. We are a near shore operator. We have floating fish farms in a closed containment. Closed containment means the fish are in tanks where we control the water quality, but we want to avoid any discharge in the surrounding waters. And the other aspect, we want to be carbon neutral. Carbon neutral aquaculture is possible if you combine solar power generation with fish farming. Both solar power generation and fish farming need huge horizontal spaces. The space on buildings is not enough for solar farming. You want big spaces. And therefore, if we have a connection to the power grid, we can use on sunny days the additional energy that we generate to feed into the grid, and during the night and rainy days we can get power from the grid, and obviously that way we avoid burning fossil fuels and we avoid storage, which is possible but costly. And I mean, fish farming or farming in general is not a business where high margins are the norm, so you have to be very, very careful with your costs, and that's why this is an important factor. But let me also add the S and the G to the ESG question. From a social point of view, all the farms here in Singapore have foreign workers from Myanmar or other countries. They leave families and kids behind. They work here for years. One of our workers is here for 10 years now. uninterrupted, so to speak. It's very difficult for them to go back to Myanmar due to the political situation. So in the long run, we have to ask ourselves if that is a sustainable component. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to have much more interesting jobs in aquaculture, not the traditional view of a fish farm worker. And therefore, we attract other people, younger people with education in aquaculture that bring different skills. We do a lot with data, computers, etc. So we are also changing the face of the jobs that we can offer in that sector, and that is clearly a social component. And finally, if you look at farming compared with its alternatives, of course, farming can be better regulated and monitored than, for example, fisheries that go and overfish the oceans with all the side effects, actually also socially for the people working there. It's often no fun. Therefore, from a governance point of view, we believe that farming has also advantages and needs to be properly handled, the regulation and the monitoring, of course.
During the last time we met, I told you that I'd watched Seaspiracy on Netflix, and I felt like not eating fish ever again. And you told me, well, I'm solving that for you through my fish farm.
That's true, and I'm also not a great fan of that show, actually, because it's rather superficial in its approach to the problems. But I mean, it's out there, and some of the concerns, of course, are valid, but some are exaggerated, and I think we need a little bit more in-depth discussion about these aspects to come to grips with them.
Right. I want to follow up on something that you discussed earlier. I haven't had the pleasure of visiting your farm yet, but since you mentioned that you have solar cells producing electricity and a fish farm, so will I see a body of water that is covered by solar cells? Is that what I'll see when I go
You see a roof. You see 4 roofs of our 4 farms that are completely covered with solar panels, and we have around 0.8 megawatt peak capacity. So that's already quite something. But unfortunately, we can only afford storage, battery storage that gives us around 2 hours without sun of running our energy-intensive processes. And therefore, we are very keen to get that connection to the grid.
Yeah. I can't wait to come for a visit one of these days.
Anytime, you're more than welcome.
Right. Now, your 10-year journey also had 2.5 years of very peculiar phase, which is the pandemic.
Yes.
How do you manage during that time?
Actually, we were doing well because people shifted from going out for dinner to ordering online, and we had both to offer, as we just discussed. And we had actually a good time, and we were also an essential service, so our work continued. We hardly noticed that there was a pandemic, except that the roads were always empty when we went to work, which was quite eerie. But we had a good time. What we did learn is 2 things, I would say. The last mile delivery is critical from a point of cost. And also, especially when you have perishable goods, you need refrigerated trucks, etc. So route planning and also sizable orders. That's why we didn't only sell fish, but also other things to make the basket bigger and more valuable. That's critical. And the other thing that was clear to all and affected us immediately, indirectly, showed how vulnerable Singapore, a country which imports 98% of its food from overseas, becomes in a pandemic. And now think about political issue or even a military escalation. So it became clear that the supply of food cannot be always taken for granted. And I may go a step further. The supply of cheap food from our neighboring countries, in the case of fish, can also not be taken for granted. Will it always be delivered? Will it always be that cheap? Is it always available? So the issue of food security is not a luxury. It's mandatory from a safety point of view. And that's what's happening now. And I think that's a lesson we all learned. I'm not speaking for the government, but I think it's common sense now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's put some numbers. Give me a sense of the scale of your operation. What is your production like, and what are your targets in the coming years?
So we are currently having a capacity for 752,000 tons per year of fish. We mainly produce barramundi and hybrid grouper, but we're also venturing into other species. But our real target is something else. We want to create scale that really makes us competitive in Singapore, because fish farming at that scale is not competitive. Competitive scale is starting in a couple of thousands tons per year output. You have economies of scale, you have shared services, and you also justify the connection to the power grid, which is, of course, an investment. So we are promoting that concept of a scale-up farm like ours, which is not only there for us, but which would also offer operators as tenants that can come and rent a farm unit. But we would make sure that the processes, the setup is proper, and they can operate and produce the fish there, so that we are not on our own with, for example, that infrastructure investment. And then on the other hand, our plan is and then that's also happening. There's a lot of money right now that is given to science and research around aquaculture. And we want to have focused research that really benefits what we are doing in nutrition, in vaccination, in the analytics of the water, microbiome of the water, also of the fish. And we want to take advantage of that. And with that, we want to create solutions that are scalable and sellable. So we are not actually a fish farm only. Of course, we produce fish, but what we want to do is we want to sell plug-and-play farms, the complete concept, including the combination of fish farming and solar farming as a package. And that is interesting in the Middle East, that is interesting in the region, and the start should be in Singapore, and that's what we are working on. That's our real target.
That's awesome. Very ambitious, but a bunch of follow-ups because I have so many questions on what you just said. Firstly, when you were talking about the 700 tons or so annual production, give me a sense in terms of relative to Singapore's total consumption a year.
So Singapore is importing in total seafood, fish, fresh and frozen, about 130,000 tons. Of that fish, I would assume, is about 60,000 tons. That is split to a degree into fresh and frozen. Of that, produced in Singapore at the moment is something like 5,000 to 7,000 tons, including some trading where you bring in mid-sized fish that you grow out here later, so part of it is imported. So our 1,000 compared to the local production are meaningful, but in terms of where we are, the total need, we are nowhere. And if you think 30 by 30, my argument is always, if you want to achieve in the specific conditions of Singapore 30 by 30, fish, the one thing that you can really produce here has to be higher than 30%, so the average becomes 30.
Yeah.
So we are talking as an aspirational target about 30,000 tons per year or something. And that scale up that we are currently aiming at is to produce 2,500 to 3,000 tons as a first step. But we are open to do more. We are open for business.
You can realistically visualize right now capacity to produce 3,000?
Absolutely. We just have to build the farms. And the farm to build costs you 6 to 9 months. And then it's a bit of a run-in, but we have done it now 4 times. So it's only money and time that is required.
But 30,000, would that require a complete geographical reorientation of Singapore?
Not necessarily. You just need, over time, much more of what we call these RES parks. So one RES park can produce 2,500 tons. It's a concept that is completely drawn out with all the drawings, with all the connections of whatever you need, not only for energy, also for feed, for oxygen, for water, for whatever. So if you want to produce 30,000 tons, you need a couple of those, and it will take some time, but it is possible if we want that.
Okay. Now, you mentioned also that you would like to make your technology and your system available for others to come and work and produce fish as well. Is it almost like a franchise model? Is that
something like that? Yes. We want to separate the ownership of the asset, so to speak, and also the operator. And we don't want to be the only operator. We offer a farming solution for Singapore in this context, where we want others to participate in or have the ability to participate in. And there's a lot of transformation in the industry. Traditional farmers leaving their farms, giving the license back, but they understand fish. and they have they have an affinity to the industry. So maybe we can help them, we can train them, we can give a helping hand in running that, but we make them responsible for one farm unit, which can produce, let's say, 250,000 tons per year. That would be their baby. We helping them that it runs. We do the backup. We do whatever is required. But it's their responsibility. What species, the husbandry is under their control. They feed the fish. They harvest the fish. They do all this around whatever is required around the fish, and we make sure we do everything around the technology.
Well, good luck with that. I mean, I think that could be a very good galvanizing factor for a wider community instead of just one group of people pursuing the same model. Dirk, once I read somewhere Michael Voigtman saying that SAT is not just a fish farming place, but it's also a data farming place. So explain to me what that means.
Well, fish farming is very complex. It sounds easy, and we thought it was easy, but actually it's a little bit more complicated. You need deep knowledge of chemistry, biology, and their interplay. And you also need to know exactly what's happening in your water, because fish are in water, and water carries the parasites, the pathogens, bacteria, viruses, etc. So what we're trying to do is we collect as many data as possible. We have our IoT data from our automation and what we call a smart farm. We have manual recordings, the water chemistry, health observations, and then we have oxygen levels. We have all kinds of environmental data from the point of the fish. What is he surrounded with? And we also have, of course, the performance data, which are mainly survival rate, growth rate, and feed conversion rate. And we put all this in a data lake. And first of all, we use the data lake, which is cloud-based, of course, and make the visualization of our of certain graphs and of certain effects possible, right? So we have all our graphs. What is our growth rate? What is our survival rate? What is our feed conversion rate? And all these things. But more interestingly than that, we are looking at the what if or why that. So the multifactorial outcome that we have in a fish farm that's caused by many factors, that is what we try to understand. So we put the data in the data lake to do modern data analytics, of course, machine learning and all these things support it, and find patterns that determine a certain outcome. And we do this in order to be more productive and to be more successful. And that is part of what we call why we are an aquaculture platform and not only a fish farmer, because we develop these software as a service products, if you want, that are an income stream and a revenue potential in its own right, but they are also part of our platform that come together with the plug-and-play farms and bring the promise with it to be more successful. But it's not a tool where you press the button and you get the output. You have to work with it, you have to use it over time, and you have to learn together with it to understand what's really happening. And that's what Michael meant when I said we are also data farmers. And big data is in everybody's, but you get the idea that we want to develop into industry knowledge by finding out more and more and more, in particular if we're working at scale, and if others would buy our farms and we would share the data from all those farms. We get smarter as we speak.
No, I appreciate what you're saying. I mean, data on its own is not a panacea, but it can be very helpful if it's collected on a systematic basis. I mean, we see this in large-scale industrial farming in the U.S. You've got, drone technology mapping fields and collecting a lot of data and very advanced weather forecasting coming in to figure out how much water the land needs. But that is not 100% the solution. Even after all that, the farmer on the ground has to make certain adjustments, and that's what causes a farm to succeed. So I sort of appreciate that nuance. So thank you for that. I've got a lot more follow-ups for you, but you got to wait for a second because I want to ask Lily a couple of questions. Earlier, from algae to skincare and the complexities associated with that, we were talking about it. What's the big deal with skincare? Why is that such a big industry, and why are you so interested in that?
So skincare has always been important for women, cosmetics, skincare in general. But we're coming from an angle that we want effective, clean skincare. So I would say we're looking for, which is also a trend lately, for green, clean skincare. And what does that mean? It means there's a EWG category that they put you into. And if you can score, it's a score from 1 to 5, I think. And we try to be 1 in all the categories for the types of chemicals we use. And we try to minimize as much as possible. So no phosphates, parabens, paraffins. So we try to be as clean as possible. And algae, using the omegas, it's already a green and natural ingredient that
vegan even.
Vegan.
You also said blue. What does that mean?
Okay, blue is marine.
Okay.
At first, we wanted to focus on something that's green and clean, but the blue is now being used a lot this term, and we believe that we are also part of this blue movement just because we're using algae. But there's even more. But there's even more about this algae that is the blue movement means. It means protecting the marine life, marine biology, the oceans. But we're not necessarily there. We are sustainable. Our company's sustainable, but we're not there to protect marine life. We're using marine algae, Nanochloropsis to be exact.
Right. And just coming back to the point of skincare, only for women?
No, it's for everyone. It's for male, female, children, elderly. It's for everyone. We have 3 different versions of the skincare. Actually, we only have about 6 SKUs. There's a cleaner, a cleanser, as well as a sunblock. But the main products will most likely be only 3, and it depends on for example, the first one is a bit lighter for lighter skin, for youthful skin. The second one is for day and night for somebody who wants a little bit more hydration and support. And a third version is extremely rich, and it's for a very dry, cold climates that you could go, for example, when you go skiing or if you go hiking in the Himalayas. I mean, I won't go hiking in the Himalayas, but something a bit stronger. Okay. So it'll be not many SKUs, because we want it to be no fuss either. Just clean, effective, no fuss skincare.
I want to hear your thoughts on branding a little bit.
Right.
So when we talk about skincare, we always associate that with Korea. In the last decade or so, Korea has become very good at marketing products that are associated with excellence, and Korean skincare products seem to be the thing to have. With Japan, we can think of, back in the days, it was electronics. Now, like when we think about fine fruits, a melon that costs $100, the Japanese are very good at making it. You are producing this from Singapore. How do you plan to brand Singapore?
Yeah. So we had categorically decided to produce, compound everything here in Singapore, and also use Singapore as the launching pad. We believe Singapore has that credibility and that respect on the international stage. And we feel that being here, it's the right time to have that stamp from Singapore, because it has that respect and it has that credibility. We're also the fact that we have we have an innovative use of a technology that Dr. Sergey created here in Singapore, and Singapore is also high tech. So that makes sense. It reflects what Singapore has to offer, and our product reflects Singapore. So I think it's a good marriage between the two. The imagery, our products are clean and green. Singapore is clean and green. So it makes sense from all different angles.
Right. So Lelya, just when I was writing this question, I was just thinking in my head as well that what are the other ways it can happen, right? So I take all your points, that's fantastic, but I really want to stress on that high-tech part that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Because in the last couple of years, as you can see, that in the global semiconductor space, all of a sudden attention has come back to Singapore, that the super high-tech companies see Singapore as a mecca, if you will, for high-tech innovation. So somehow intersecting your products with that high-tech branding, I think makes a lot of sense. And I think that I'm sort of surprised that Singapore branding hasn't gone farther. We think of Singapore Airlines as a number 1 airline in the world, and its brands very, very well in terms of the quality of services it offers. Beyond that, there are not that many global brands. So I hope that, Alghemy becomes one of those brands, which is synonymous with Singapore's clean and green and excellent and high-tech aspects.
And you also mentioned before about COVID, and that was convenient for us to have decided to compound here in Singapore, because many people compound outside of Singapore and produce in Switzerland or in Korea. And by having us decide on Singapore, we were able to still formulate and work during COVID.
Fantastic.
I might make one small comment. Singapore was always more trading and services economy than it was a product branding or product creation or even, it's more a component supply when it comes to products. So that's also maybe a little bit what's in the background of this, that we have such rare, relatively success stories of something produced and then globally branded coming from Singapore. So hopefully we can both, with Alghemy and with our plug-and-play farms, which we call RES Park, get there in the future.
Yeah, I'm really interested in the plug-and-play aspect. I remember a few years ago reading about how sort of Changi Airport wants to make its operation a bit of a plug-and-play for airports around the world. That look at our operation manual, look at our sort of adherence to safety and product delivery standards, and we can help you replicate that elsewhere. So yeah, do that. I think it's just a matter of time before that sort of catches on.
We look at the Middle East, we look at the region, and we look also at the time when people understand that traditional fish farming methods are not the answer for the future. We need more resilient, more robust systems.
Okay, interesting that you said that. So traditional fish farming methods. So you are doing something which is great. You're marrying technology and ESG practices and you're producing, but you're still producing real fish. Seems like the future of food production is also going in the direction of synthetic or lab-grown meat and lab-grown fish and all that. What's your view on that?
Well, of course, it's a controversial topic. We are farming an animal that was developed by the evolution over millions of years. It's a very efficient animal if you think of feed conversion rates, protein production in itself. And we compare that now with scientists and that want to create something in the lab that replaces that evolutionary process. And they're using clean room environment. They're using the most expensive ingredients. They're using energy and equipment that is expensive, and they can create something out of that. So if we compare that, we have to compare it holistically, and I'm personally not convinced that lab-grown proteins are the answer to feed the world or are competitive, at least not now, compared with at least fish farming. On the other hand, this is a science endeavor that might lead to some progress, and you don't know what it's good for. It can have benefits in health, nutrition, medicine, in all kinds of ways, that lab-grown protein approach. So we have to stay open-minded. But speaking for SIT and Michael and I, we stay with the natural processes and the real product, which is the fish. And our motto is teaming up with nature.
Right. And also, I think one of the major arguments in favor of lab-grown protein is that naturally grown protein is very carbon intensive, and especially with respect to cattle farming, creates a huge amount of greenhouse emission. But at the onset, you pointed out that you think that your fish farming model can be carbon neutral.
Yes, and in defense of the cows, I know the methane product and the emission, but they also eat the grass. And who else would eat the grass? So they have also evolutionary, if you come from evolution, there's a reason, because we don't eat the grass. So the grass needs to be eaten by the cows, and what we have to deal with is the emissions of the cow, for example, by adding seaweed components or others. But anyway, this is more. We stay to where we are, and we want to be carbon neutral in the sense that we marry solar farming with fish farming. That's the big thing. We are connected to the green plan of Singapore. If we have this, what I call that RES Park, that scaled up version of what we're doing, we can create 4 to 5 megawatt peak of energy, and we only need a quarter of that. But of course, over the year, since you have day and night and rainy days and sunshine, it's carbon neutral. We wouldn't be a net producer yet. But then If you look at the sea spaces still available for sea farming in Singapore, where we are off the coast of Pasir Ris, we have 100 hectares. So those 100 hectares are not utilized completely. Why not put a complete solar farm in there that is lifted up on rooftop, and underneath, over time, you add all the fish farming that you need. You might not start with 100 hectares, of course not, but that space is available. And show me somewhere else in Singapore where you have 100 hectares where you could put solar farming on. It's not happening.
Right.
So it's a great synergy that we now have to, we have to make it happen. So we need EMA, we need SPPG, we need the approvals for it. MPA has to play a role, but the technology is there. We have floating solar farms on reservoirs and in the causeway. The next step is only lift them up and put fish farming underneath. Then you have a wonderful combination.
Right. Whenever drive around open air parking lots, I always say to myself, why can't there be some solar cells on top of this open air parking lots? But of course yours, much bigger cross section. Now we are having this conversation in late October 2023. That means we have just about 7 years left before 2030. It is, in your view, possible that 30,000 tons that you were talking about by 2030 in Singapore?
It's a very ambitious, or as they here sometimes say, aspirational target. It's possible, but it takes action now and not later. And if I may say that, if I look at the amounts of money that are now spent in research, which is justified, in comparison, the amounts for scaling up the infrastructure to produce are neglectable or negligible, actually. They're too small. We have to scale up. We have to bring, ideally, private and public money together to create the utilities that can produce. Because coming back to what we said in the beginning, we are talking also about food security and national interest. And you don't get that for free. And you cannot always wait for private money. Private money, and also the banks, if I may say that, is reluctant to invest in farming. Farming is considered not extremely margin and commercially viable, or not. You don't make much money in farming, let's put it this way. And I remember one of your banker colleagues years ago said to me, Dirk, whatever you're telling me is great, but you have to remember one thing: fish can die. Which is, of course, true. What he meant is prematurely die. And
right.
What he meant is the risk in farming, in particular when you have livestock. And therefore, you see the reluctance in doing the next step, meaning financing this scale up and believing that we can make it. But if we continue to delay the required build-up in capacities, we can't make it. And if I may also say that, we had some setbacks recently, also farms leaving Singapore with their production, and that was linked to outbreaks that we had from a viral disease or whatever. This is actually not correct. Those viruses, bacteria, and pathogens are out for the last 10, 20 years. The question is, were these farms using the methods that are suitable to deal with the local environment? And we have to draw the conclusion. We are in competing approaches. It's not SAT and nobody else. We need competing research. We need competing farms. But we also have to look at them carefully. What approach makes more sense and is more successful? And in our grow-out, if I may say that, we have 1% mortality per month in our entire farm. The challenge is more in the stage until 100 gram. That's typically also, as the Norwegians do it, doing it separated between land-based farming and sea-based farming. We can talk about that. But we are successful in that. We have that under control. And now we need to convince the different players, private money, venture capital, private equity, and also, in my view, public money, to create the utility that can produce, as long as we believe in the process, in the operators, and have a backup. And for Singapore, the backup is us. Whoever as a tenant or operator fails in our setup, we take over. You're not sitting there with a collateral or whatever you call it, and you're left alone. We take over. And over time, we will have others that can be trained in an academy or whatever. They can do it as well as we can do it.
It's highly commendable, and your sense of urgency, I think, is just apropos. Dirk, just from a zoomed out macro perspective globally, where do we stand with fish farming? I mean, Singapore has super high levels of urgency, but are other countries a little more blasé?
Well, the question is, what are the alternatives? We spoke about overfishing. We have a constant output of wild-caught fish over the last years, although the fleets go further and further, do more damage than ever. The stocks are not everywhere depleting, but we won't get more out of the oceans. And from all the other aspects, ESG, etc., that's not the alternative. If we look at fish compared with cattle or with other animals, and not all of us want to become vegan or vegetarian. That's also a fact. Animals are a protein source. Then fish is a great alternative. So the investment in aquaculture is huge, and it will continue to be huge all over the world. And there will be setbacks. It's not easy. We see that not only in Singapore. Look at what's happening in America with the people who try RES farming of salmon, Atlantic Sapphire, or even though the big players. There are severe setbacks, but that will not break the trend. It will continue. There will be a lot of money invested in aquaculture, and aquaculture, fish farming, will continue to grow. I'm totally convinced of that. And then it's a question who does it best and who is successful commercially. And that's, of course, is what the markets decide.
Right. Dirk, I originally come from Bangladesh, and it's a country of 170 million people on a landmass the size of Wisconsin. But somehow, some miraculous reason, because of aquaculture, there is self-sufficiency in fish. Of course, the country is full of rivers, and therefore it's easy to do aquaculture, but it shows you that you don't need massive land masses to provide a fish protein to a large population. So super inspired by both of you. Thank you so much for coming to Kopi Time, and I wish both of your ventures, all the success.
Thank you very much.
It
was
great to have you. No,
thank you.
And thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Ken Delbridge. Violet Lee and Daisy Sharma provided additional assistance. This podcast is for information only and does not constitute any investment advice. All 111 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube, as well as on all podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications and webinars, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.